For the last few months, a lot of Canadians have been focused on buying Canadian at the grocery store. This is in response to U.S. President Donald Trump's talk and tariffs. But some experts are saying there may actually be a health and safety reason to avoid U.S. products. 80% of food regulation in the U.S. is done by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. And since Trump took office back in January, thousands of jobs have been cut from the FDA. That's raising some concerns about the safety of the food that comes across the border to Canada. So today, I'm talking to Kate Helmore. She's the Globe's agriculture and food policy reporter. Kate will talk about the cuts we've seen at the FDA, what experts are worried about, and what we should be considering when we're at the grocery store. I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms, and this is The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. Kate, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just start with some of the basics here. How connected are the Canadian and the American food systems?
When we talk about food production and consumption in Canada, we saw this during the threat of the tariffs, is the US and the Canadian system are hugely intertwined. Products go back and forth across that border like water. It's completely porous.
It's like a lot of products then. So.
Like a lot of our products. If we're talking about something, for example, let's just take beef, for instance. The cow might be raised in Canada, sent across the US to be fattened up, brought back for a feedlot, sent back to the US for slaughter, and then brought back in the shape of a hamburger.
Wow.
And the people who work in that industry don't really see that border as a thick line. When we're talking about food, really what matters is geographical distances. How far do you have to transport something? Because food can be very difficult, depending on the product, to move. You think about refrigerated trucks, you think about livestock,
right.
Those kinds of things. The US is a very, very important partner for us. And I mean, Canada, we are what we are. And for a large stretch of the year, we cannot grow food in our ground, right? Like you can't grow lettuce in Manitoba in February.
Yeah.
So we're using US production, but we're also using the US as a free point. Like if we're bringing something in from Mexico, for example, it might come up through the US too. So really, when you think about food and agriculture, you have to think about it in a North America-wide context.
Okay.
Really, really important that we do that.
All right, so that kind of gives us a sense then of how important the U.S. is for our food system. And when we're talking about food, of course, safety is such a huge part of this, right? So let's just go over how this works. If we're looking at Canada, how does our food safety system work when we're importing things?
Okay.
Who's responsible for looking at this?
Yeah, I mean, I think something to mention off the top is that Canada has an excellent global reputation for food safety. In fact, The Economist publication regularly updates their Global Food Security Index. And that's an index that looks at affordability, availability, quality, and safety across 113 countries. Canada is number one when it comes to food safety. We're followed by Denmark in the second position and the US in third. So, hey, that's something that we do better than the Americans.
Something we can be proud of.
It's always nice to hear. And so food safety in Canada comes under the purview of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which we call the CFIA.
Okay. And so how does this work then? Like if things are crossing into Canada, do we inspect everything? How do we decide what actually does get inspected then?
Yeah, the volume of food that crosses into Canada is so huge, it'd be absolutely impossible to inspect everything. The CFIA doesn't or didn't give me the data on what percentage they inspect. However, sources told me that anecdotal industry estimates put it about 1% of food that crosses our border we inspect.
So most of it's not inspected then?
The vast majority is not inspected. And when we're talking about that 1% that is inspected, that's 1% visual inspection. So a truck crosses the border, you open the box, it says cucumbers on the box, cucumbers inside the box. Okay, great. And then it's about 0.1% for further inspection that might include like lab testing or something like that. So the vast majority is not. That's because it would just be such an impediment to trade. If every truck that crossed this border carrying food, or every ship that arrived at our ports carrying food had to be inspected, it would never get to the grocery store. Like, it would never happen.
Just like so time consuming then.
So time consuming, so costly, the delays would be insane. So What the CFIA does is something called the importer risk assessment model. The likelihood that a product is to be inspected is based on a risk. The factors that determine how risky that product is, there's kind of three big ones. The first is like inherent risk factors. So some food is just more likely to have disease or illness or bacteria than other food. If you think about romaine lettuce and all the issues we've had with E. coli and romaine lettuce, that's a high-risk product.
So more likely to be inspected then.
More likely to be inspected. Another one would be compliance. So, what is the reputation of this importer? Does this importer have a squeaky clean reputation? They have really high standards. There's never been any problems with any of their products. Or does this importer, do they have a track record of recalls? More likely to be flagged for inspection. And then the third one is mitigation factors. And under that is country of origin. How much do we recognize and respect the food safety systems of the country this food is coming from?
Okay. Well, this, I guess, brings us to the U.S. then. How does the U.S. system work? And how much trust do we have in this system?
Yeah, the U.S. is a little bit more complicated. There's two national agencies that deal with food safety in the U.S. You have the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, which falls under the Health and Human Services Department. And then you've got Food Safety and Inspection Service, the FSIS, which falls under the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the USDA.
Okay.
The FDA does the vast majority of food safety in the US. We're talking 80%. And then the rest is the USDA, and that handles meat, poultry, egg products, and for some reason, catfish.
Just specifically catfish?
I asked a source why, and they just said, don't get into it. But everything else is the FDA.
Okay, so we'll focus on the FDA because, as you said, 80%. That's the vast majority of food then.
For sure.
Okay, so you mentioned those three factors that Canada looks at when we import food. The third one being mitigation factors, the country of origin being the big thing. So how do we treat food that comes from the U.S.?
The US and Canada have a pretty unique agreement. It's called the 2016 Recognition Agreement between the CFIA and the FDA. And the agreement basically says, we recognize your system. We think it's great. We think it's comparable to our own, right? And in that way, Canada is basically saying to the US, hey, we think products from your country, because of your standards, are lower risk than products from even the United Kingdom, Finland, countries that also have solid food safety. But the US has that kind of special agreement. We don't have that agreement with anyone else.
All right. So it's an exceptional situation that we have here between Canada and the U.S. when it comes to food safety. But now, of course, a lot of government departments in the U.S. have seen some changes under President Trump. And this includes the FDA, which is the big organization that is responsible for most of the food that we're getting from the U.S. So what exactly have we seen change here, Kate?
Yeah, I think that's the crux of this story, right? I want to preface it by saying that I'm not about to argue that U.S. food is unsafe. There are really, really good businesses in the US. There are good farmers. There are good manufacturers. There are good logistics companies that care about the safety of the food they produce. It is very costly. Recalls are costly to reputations and financially costly. However, what we've seen happen with the FDA is a significant amount of layoffs. There was promised 19% cut across the FDA workforce. That resulted in 3,500 employees that were immediately put on leave in April. The layoffs were primarily focused on what the administration called administrative functions. So that was the staff at the FDA's main communications department. These are the employees that are typically tasked with briefing national news outlets during, outbreaks. They've been fired. So have staff at public record offices. It's important to note that no inspector jobs were cut. None of the jobs for the people who go to plants and inspect what's happening there were cut. However, the staff that support those inspectors were cut. So, for example, think about people who arrange your travel, your expenses, all the people who make it possible for you to do your job if you're an inspector. Those jobs were on the line, and many of them were eliminated. The inspectors, alongside all federal employees, were also offered retirement packages, and a number of them took it because their jobs seemed harder moving forward without that kind of support. And a government-wide hiring freeze meant the FDA couldn't replace those employees. So according to CBS, about 1 in 5 jobs now lay vacant in the inspection division at the start of June.
Well, that seems significant then. So even if you're saying, the organization didn't want to cut inspector roles, if 1 in 5 inspector roles are vacant, that must be having an impact.
Yeah. And, U.S. outlets are reporting on numerous voices from those inspectors saying, we can't do our jobs. We do not have the manpower or the time to reach the number of plants or manufacturing facilities that we need to. We cannot meet our basic requirements.
Yeah, that must be concerning then if we're hearing from these individuals that they're not able to essentially do the job the way that they should be doing the job.
Definitely. The other things that are changing with the FDA is there's also been a cancellation of a number of programs, agencies, committees. For example, a committee tasked with exploring a range of food safety questions, including kind of what strains might cause bloody diarrhea, for instance, or kidney failure. That's been shut down. So has a program to improve bird flu testing. The Justice Department that handles criminal and civil enforcement of U.S. food and drug safety laws has been disbanded. And the Food and Drug Administration is also suspending a quality control program for testing of fluid milk and other dairy products.
So this sounds like it's all kind of part of this bigger U.S. government move to kind of get leaner and cut a lot of jobs.
Yes, exactly. And I think it should be said up front that the FDA, like any agency, has problems. Trump is not the first president, and he won't be the last president to think about how we can make this agency more efficient. The concern that I'm hearing from food safety experts is the speed at which this is happening. No one's questioning whether efficiencies are there, whether there is redundancies in this agency. The question is how much thought went into which parts of it you cut. How reckless is this move? And a lot of people were saying this is very reckless.
We'll be back in a moment. Okay, so Kate, we know that importing food from the U.S. is very important to our Canadian food system. But now with the U.S. cutting all of these jobs that do this work within the FDA, do we know what the impact of these cuts has been?
Well, that's a really hard question to answer. And I did speak to experts who said, look, there's a lot happening and we should be watching this closely. But to this point, it's really hard. It's almost too soon to say, hey, this outbreak is specifically tied to these cuts over here. It might be one of those things where we look back in a few years and we can say, oh, okay, now we have data from 5 years on food safety, and we can see that the number of outbreaks corresponds or correlates to the cuts that we saw.
But with this mounting and growing concern, is Canada looking at that and saying maybe we should change the food safety agreement, for example, that we have with the U.S.?
Yeah. A number of food safety experts told me yes. In fact, one lawyer who specializes in recall says, I will not be touching U.S. leafy greens.
Wow.
I will not be eating those because I don't trust it.
She's saying for herself, she's not going to do that.
And, she'd worked for decades in food recalls. And other experts saying, yes, we need to stop being reactive. We need to stop waiting until people start getting seriously sick before we start responding to these problems. Food safety needs to become more preventative. We need to get ahead of the game, essentially.
So it sounds like experts that you've talked to are kind of sounding the alarm here. What more did you hear from them?
Yeah, that was how they felt about this. But then when we went to the CFIA turned around and said, no, we believe that the current systems we have in place are adequate. It is very, very difficult and very costly to change how we approach imports. So let's just give you an example. Let's say we said, based on these headlines and based on these changes, we're going to up inspections of US food crossing our border from whatever it is right now. We were going to inspect 10% of it. That's a significant amount, but just say 10%. That means that if you are a truck driver who brings in cantaloupes from the south of the US into Toronto, crossing the border at Windsor, you're going to be seeing a lot more inspections. That means you're going to be seeing more delays. That's going to cost you manpower. It's going to cost you time on the road. It's going to cost you in your relationship with your client, with your retailers. All of those costs will come down to the consumer. Ultimately, do we really want to be making those kind of decisions based on the fact that we don't currently, to this point, know exactly how this is going to play out?
So even though there are some concerns being raised, it sounds like the CFIA, the Canadian agency, is saying at this point it's not worth the extra time and effort to do these extra inspections.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't tell me that specifically. They just said that this is adequate. But when I went back to other food safety experts, I spoke to an agricultural trade lawyer, and they said, yes, like, we're concerned. The CFIA should be watching this very, very closely. But there are very real costs to making changes here. And those businesses, if they're going to incur those costs, need to know that it's a real concern. For example, something that the CFIA did do is it made changes to imports of romaine lettuce from California. That's where we get pretty much all of our romaine lettuce from, is California. And we saw so many outbreaks of E. coli. A lot of this lettuce was being grown downstream from massive feedlots. So feedlots is where we fatten up cattle, right? And so the manure was going into the water, and then it was going downstream, and then it was being sprayed on the crops. And Bob's your uncle, you've now got...
Sounds very bad, yes.
You've got bacteria in lettuce. And so now the CFIA says, you know, if that lettuce is coming in, they've put extra controls on it. There should be extra testing. We're not taking in lettuce from this specific region without that kind of thorough testing. You can do that, and you can justify that to the public, and you can justify that to the businesses who operate in this space, because you can say, hey, look, people are getting really sick, and we know it's got to do with this. And experts will say, we can't just change the way we operate based on concerns about what might happen.
So it sounds like we need evidence. So like this specific example of E. coli and lettuce, that was evidence. Then the Canadian agency could say, okay, we're going to increase inspections. But without that evidence, it won't really happen.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's also something else kind of going on in the background here. When we're talking about food imports, this is food trade. And that comes under the World Trade Organization. And the World Trade Organization also has rules about how much you can restrict trade. Right? So there should be very much an evidence-based concern before you decide to start restricting trade, because otherwise, as you can imagine, you're going to have special interest groups in a country pressuring a government to raise concerns, some of those concerns, phantom concerns, about a certain food group. And it's not really about food safety. It's about the fact that they don't want global competition. So there's also, bigger than all of this, there also needs to be some kind of guiding principles that we operate under, despite the fact that the US seems to be not abiding by a lot of those things right now. It's this idea that simply because others are losing their heads doesn't mean Canada should too. That's that side of the argument. But again, I had other food safety experts saying, to hell with it, these are people's lives and we need to start acting aggressively and preventatively.
Yeah, because I think people would understand this is a pretty high stakes, right? This is the safety of the food that we're consuming.
Yeah, and again, it goes back into bigger questions. This is not just food safety, right? We are so dependent on the US. The US has been our closest partner, trading partner for a very long time, but they've also been a really close partner in terms of shared values. I mean, I'm the agricultural reporter, right? Like, we base a lot of our science on how to best grow crops, on how to best raise livestock, on the US's robust research and innovation sector, because they just have so much more muscle than we do. What happens when those values don't line up with ours anymore? What happens when we can't trust them anymore? What do we do?
So, Kate, it sounds like a lot of the experts you talked to were kind of sounding the alarm on this situation. I'm just curious, though, was there also the other side represented here? Like, did you hear from people who didn't think that this was such a big deal at the moment?
Yeah. Actually, I did speak to one Canadian food safety expert who was skeptical. I think in the background, look, the FDA is not perfect, right? No agency is. The president has consistently said that the agency is riddled with corruption, conflicts of interest, and ties to pharmaceutical industry, because the FDA also does drug approvals and stuff like that too. Of course, President Trump offered no evidence to support these claims. There's something that is worth noting, though, is that the FDA does have a complicated dual mandate. So it's a science-backed agency and it's focused on public health, but the FDA's financial model is also based on user fees paid by industry that makes and markets FDA-regulated products. And this supplements the funding the FDA receives from Congress. That system has drawn growing political scrutiny that surpasses Trump. It's just this idea of how independent is the science if it's partly paid for by industry, right? The other things is such as that a number of states also do their own food inspection. So there's questions of like, okay, why is the FDA paying to inspect these plants and then the state is going in and doing the same thing? Like, why is there this double work happening, this double money?
So it sounds like a bit of criticism just of the way that the FDA is kind of run.
Absolutely. And there's also this idea that inspections can't be everything. You know, let's say you have a sandwich plant, someone who makes sandwiches, and you have the inspectors and they come by semi-regularly and they look in and they say, okay, there's a number of infractions here. You know, you guys need to fix this stuff. But there's no follow-up. Like they never hear back and they never get the fines or they never get then what does that say to the plant? It says, okay, yeah, it's okay to get away with not following the rules.
Yeah, it's not such a big deal if no one's following up with you.
Absolutely. And these skeptical voices were saying, yeah, you can't just focus wholeheartedly on inspections. Like, and if all your money is going towards that and we're not thinking about what the next stages and next steps of this are, then that's a problem. And so, look, there were problems with the FDA and it needed a bit of an overhaul. An overhaul that, by the way, started with the Biden administration. In October of 2024, Biden's administration launched a massive modernization and restructuring of the FDA. But underneath all of that is, okay, but is this the speed at which we should be doing it? Is this too reckless?
So there might be problems with the FDA, of course, the way that it is run, but it sounds like there's a lot of people raising concerns with the current cuts and how this is happening. Kate, before I let you go here, I guess I want to come back to the experts that you spoke to and what they were saying about how concerned they are and how concerned maybe Canadians should be about this. Like, do they think Canadians need to be changing their shopping habits at grocery stores, or what's the level of worry here?
Yeah, I mean, it's a range. Some, like the one I spoke about, one expert who said, I will not be buying leafy greens from the US, right? And some saying, I'm watching very, very closely, but I'm not willing to change my buying habits. What I don't want you, the listener, to walk away from this podcast feeling is hopeless. I actually think this is an opportunity for Canada to reflect. So what I've heard over and over and over again in my years of reporting on agriculture is that Canada is an agricultural heavyweight. We grow so much food. We export far more than we consume. However, what we don't do very well is grow and make food that you can put on the shelf and you can eat, right? So if you think about the prairies, we grow so much grain and then we send it to terminals and then we put it on ships and we send it overseas, right? Or if we look at cattle, we raise these cows and then we send them to the US where they're slaughtered. Because we don't invest in processing or manufacturing.
We have the first base ingredient essentially, and that's about it.
Yeah, we do raw commodities. And this is not just food. This is the criticism that's lobbied at the logging industry as well, right? Like, where are all those jobs going? We just send them overseas. It's not just about the jobs, though. It's about having food sovereignty. It's about investing in Canadian food sovereignty so that when stuff like this happens, when a major trading partner imposes tariffs, or when we don't trust their food safety systems anymore, or when there's a global pandemic and supply chains are disrupted, we want to know we can feed our own people. And so this is an opportunity for us to radically think about that.
Kate, it was so great to have you here. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having me on.
That was Kate Helmore, the Globe's agriculture and food policy reporter. That's it for today. I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms. Our producers are Madeline White, Michal Stein, and Ali Graham. David Crosby edits the show. Adrian Chung is our senior producer, and Matt Frainer is our managing editor. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.